Okay, as you heard from the voice of Siri or whoever that is on that, this is being recorded. So I'm very happy to welcome everybody here to the final forum of the spring series of the Unitarian Church Forum. And I'm really, really pleased that we've got Glenn Smith from the Post and Courier here. Glenn's been associated with the public reporting arm of the Post and Courier, associated with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Till Death Us Do Part series from a few years back on domestic violence. And I believe we had Doug Pardue from the Post and Courier talking to us about that particular issue. And what Glenn is going to be talking about today is new work that they're doing at the Post and Courier on Uncovered, which is basically showing the value of local news gathering. And rather than really give a whole lot of information about Glenn at the moment, what I'm going to just do is really do some editorializing here and make a real pitch for local newspapers. Because if you just do the math, if you think about it, we have 24-hour news cycles, so-called, on television. But if you think about any given hour of so-called news programming, if you take out the advertising, if you take about the little trailers that they do, if you take out the banter, if you take out the references to what's coming up in the future, you're looking at probably, I would say, at most about 10 minutes worth per hour of real information. And if you think about the speed at which anybody speaks, and television presenters probably speak a little slower than I do, we're talking about 150 words a minute. So that means about 1,500 words worth of information in any given hour on so-called TV news programming. But 1,500 words is only a few columns, of one page of a newspaper. So newspapers can actually give us so much more information and so much more in depth. They can quote so many more people, and they don't even necessarily take our time. So I am going to make a huge pitch here for everybody to get the Post and Courier, to write letters to the Post and Courier. So the editorial page can perhaps do a little bit of shifting more in our direction. But newspapers are an absolutely fundamental public service to allow us to know what's going on. This is a country of 330 something million people. And if we just allow ourselves to get locked into the big abstractions at the national level about liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican, we just talk in abstractions about race relations or gender relations or issues of sexuality or something, we do not allow ourselves to talk about the actual things, the little actual things that we can have some control over and that we can actually begin to mitigate. So please, folks, do support local newspapers, Post and Courier, City Paper, the Charleston Chronicle. All of these things are really, really valuable. And so I'm now just going to get off my little soapbox and ask Glenn to take us on and to talk a little bit about his latest project with the Post and Courier, which is this Uncovered series. And Glenn, if you can unmute yourself and take us away from there.
No, you should keep going. I liked everything you had to say. I don't want to stand in your way there. That was all good stuff. And hopefully at the end of this, people won't say, I totally understand now why this guy went into print journalism. But anyway, just tell you a little bit about myself. I have been at the Post and Courier for 22 years now. Not planned on staying quite that long, but I'm glad I did. And I've been in journalism since 1987 when I graduated from the University of Connecticut. I spent a lot of years working as a frontline crime reporter. And then, along the way, did a lot of investigative projects and eventually became the Watchdog and Public Service Editor, which is sort of a fancy title for saying that I lead the projects team and I'm in charge of our investigations. We have a team of 5 people here, including myself, in Charleston and 2 more in Columbia. And every year we try to start out pinpointing some of the most crucial challenges facing our state and dig in to try to make some valuable change and to bring that information to people. In past years, as Simon mentioned, we've focused on the staggering death toll from domestic violence. We've looked at police shootings. We've looked at climate change driven flooding, the failings of our state educational system. And this year we settled on a project that was really near and dear, I think, to everybody, which was the demise of local newspapers and the expanding news deserts in both our state and our country. It's become like a slow building crisis over time, but one that's really taking a monumental toll. Just in the last year alone here in South Carolina, we saw 7 newspapers go under and not be replaced. And it leaves a tremendous hole since 2009, I think our newspaper pool has shrunk by about 14%. And in that same time, or since 15 years leading up to 2020, we lost a quarter of the nation's newspapers. That's 36,000 jobs in journalism. And now more than 2/3 of US counties do not have a daily newspaper. More than 200 have no newspaper at all. And in addition to South Carolina's 7 papers that went under, we lost more than 60 across the country. Now, some people may say, well, it's a 24-hour news cycle and newspapers are a vestige of a long ago era. It's sort of run its course and they don't have a place anymore. But I would argue, as Simon did, that you need us more than ever now to really cut through a lot of the, I hate the term fake news, but a lot of the chaos and the noise out there, white noise that surrounds all these hot button issues, really to present the facts in as an objective, in-depth way as possible. If you look at what happens when you don't have a newspaper in a community, well, studies have shown that there's less voter participation, that the government salaries go up, the government spending goes up, the debt rises for communities, voter participation goes down. And we've also seen, in addition to mismanagement of government, we've seen abuses of power and outright government misconduct when nobody's watching. Because newspapers, we still send people to these meetings, like zoning meetings and city council meetings, and we look at agendas and we look at meeting minutes and we ask tough questions about things. Now, if you have a community where that's not happening, then people feel less responsive. If there's not enough light coming in, people feel less responsible to act in a proper manner, I think, in some instances. The only true news desert we have right at the moment is in Allendale County, which has no news coverage at all. The paper there, a weekly newspaper, went under in 2015, and nothing has come along to replace it. Coincidence or not, in that same time period, we've seen 3 Allendale public officials be indicted for embezzlement, taking 2 at the town level or at the city level and 1 at the county level, and taking tens of thousands of dollars in some instances. These are places that can probably afford to lose that money the least. They're really struggling counties that struggle with high unemployment, high tax rates, even though they're poor, they're shrinking populations, and a whole bunch of challenges with crumbling schools and infrastructure and things like that. So they depend on a very small amount of money to get by. And if people help themselves to that money, that really hurts the bottom line for these communities and their future viability. So this year, we decided to embark on this thing we called Uncovered. And it really grew out of some work we had done a couple years ago. There was a nonprofit that was around for a while, it's gone dormant now, called Paper, started in Columbia. And Paper's goal was to find areas that they wanted to delve into and make open records requests, and then put all that information up on the web for journalists to dig into. And they hadn't really much about them, so they had FOIA'd a bunch of, that's Freedom of Information Act, they had sent in requests for a bunch of records from a prosecutor named Dan Johnson up in the 5th Circuit, which is in Richland and Kershaw. And the stuff was sitting up there on the web for a couple months, and finally somebody called us and said, hey, I heard this paper, you ought to look into these records. So we said, interesting. So 3 of us went digging through these records, and we found all sorts of crazy misspending, like going to the Galapagos Islands and having dental work done. And one of his assistants had on the public's dime, had gone to a family reunion. He had traveled to Minneapolis, and my colleague Tony Bartlemy traced his Uber rides that he charged the taxpayer for, and pretty much figured out that he'd gone to like Prince's house and some other locations. So we put that information out there in the story. He'd also like thrown lavish thousands of dollars worth holiday parties for his staff, and like flew his brother in to DJ from Arizona at the cost of thousands of dollars to the taxpayers. Anyway, we put this out there, and he said there was nothing wrong with it. The government saw otherwise. He was indicted and went to federal prison. And out of that came a number of tips about sheriffs around the state. And so Tony Bartlemy and Joe Craney, another one of our reporters, they dug hard into the sheriff issue and found all sorts of problems there. And a couple of those sheriffs have been indicted. So we started developing, I guess, some relationships and also some interest in some of these areas of the state that weren't getting covered as much. Like one sheriff who just recently was found guilty of a bunch of corruption charges was in Chester County. We didn't know a whole lot about Chester, but we heard we ought to go look there. And so Tony spent a bunch of time up there. We got to know the editor of the small paper there in Chester. It's a two-person shop. And this guy, Travis, is just, I'm just amazed by him on a daily basis, because he covers the meetings, then he goes and covers the local basketball game. Then he sorts through emails for investigative projects. Then he says, oh, I got to drop everything and run out to the lake because somebody caught like a record-sized catfish, and people love catfish photos, right? So he does everything, him and this other guy, Brian Gardner. And we got talking with him, and he was onto a lot of this stuff with the sheriff. In some cases, didn't have the resources to bring it home by getting a lot of these open records requests could cost a ton of money. He didn't have a lot of time. So he gave us some direction and the benefit of his institutional knowledge, and we dove in. And again, the sheriff was just found guilty of, and a couple of his top deputies as well. So we started saying, there's a whole bunch of this stuff happening in these rural corners that either have not much coverage or no coverage at all. What if we took a look into those areas and partnered with some of these papers that are doing very good work, but are facing real challenges with financing and time and just the resources to tackle some of these big things? We can come in and lend the benefit of our, add some extra reporters to the, add some extra reporters to the mix, add the benefit of our experience investigating some of these things and knowing what to go after. They could share with us, at the very least, the benefit of their institutional knowledge, context, the background on how these issues came to be, who these people are, who the best sources are to talk to. And if they have the time and the ability and the bandwidth to do that, they could join us as full-on partners in reporting and writing the pieces. Now, we had never tried anything like this before. I don't think anyone in the state had. So we didn't know initially how to go about it. So what we did to start off with is just called a bunch of these places, didn't know some of the editors or people there at all, and just said, hey, we got this crazy idea. It could be very beneficial, and how would you like to join up with us? It's not going to cost you a thing. There's a couple people were like, well, what's the catch? Are you looking for some money here? Are you looking? No, it's not going to cost you a thing. We just want to do good work, support the local community newspapers that are really working hard to do a good job, and also to bring light to some government misconduct around the state. So we launched our first piece in February. And we've now written more than a dozen pieces, partnered with several papers. We have 16 papers around the state that we are partnering with, including, as Simon mentioned, the Chronicle locally. We've got a Hispanic newspaper in the upstate that also covers down here. We've got a number of weeklies. We've got some medium-sized dailies like the Orangeburg paper and the Greenwood paper. Greenwood's just been doing great work too. And it's been great. We've identified a number of things, from gas authorities that have spent tens of thousands of dollars going to fancy resorts and just blowing 30 grand in a weekend, going on wine tours and zip line things and cruises. And gas authorities that we weren't, I don't even know if we knew they existed before we got into these things, or that anyone was monitoring them. And we've talked everything from oyster farms in the Low Country where there was a conflict of interest. We found nepotism and cronyism, and people helping their relatives get jobs. We've people not declaring income they're making from the very town council that they're sitting on. A whole bunch of things, and it's been really rewarding. And one of the stories I think that we did recently really was I thought it was great. The paper up in Blythewood and Fairfield County, The Voice, for 3 years, they had been trying to get access to records concerning the superintendent of schools spending. He makes a goodly sum, but he also has like a $50,000 a year discretionary account that nobody was really sure what he was spending it on. And he had some other funds and annuities. And the editor up there, Barbara Ball, who had been recognized as one of the more assertive journalists in the year in the state a couple years ago for her work up there. She's amazing, just a one-person operation with some helpers and freelancers. And Barbara had been fighting this thing and asked the superintendent for records through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, the act was changed a few years ago to add some deadlines, which were needed. It was pretty squishy on when people had to respond to get you the information. So they added in these deadlines, but they also snuck in a provision that allowed governments to charge fees for review, retrieval, and redaction of documents. And it's supposed to be the lowest paid person capable of doing that task should gather those records and get them for you. In reality, what you often have is they say, oh, if you're looking for emails, our IT director, we just got one last week, our IT director who makes $48 an hour is the lowest paid person. So it's going to cost you, $1,400 for these records, or it's going to cost you $7,000 for these records. We've been quoted as high as $200,000 for records that belong to the public. So Barbara had asked for these records and then came back and the superintendent said, you can have them, I think it was for $330. Well, the Voice paper, Barbara doesn't take a salary, we found out. She works without a salary. She pays the rent sometimes out of her own pocket. She doesn't have $330 to throw around. So she was kind of stopped in her tracks, and all she could do is write stories about how the superintendent wasn't coming through. So she asked for help with that. We requested the records. For some reason, the superintendent turned around and gave them to us for free. I don't know if it's because we're a larger paper or we don't have the history that Barbara does with him, but we really dug in on that. And we finally told that story that she had been wanting to tell for 3 years and gave the public some insight into how he's spending his money, why he's refused to cooperate with certain things. At one point, he wouldn't even tell a member of the school board how much he earned. They asked what his salary was. And he said, you could file a request for that, I guess. So we shed light on a lot of those issues. And it's rewarding to help somebody bring those types of stories home. And we've got plenty more in the works. We're planning to continue this at least through the end of this year. We've got more than 60 tips, I guess, from around the state, and plenty of them are pretty good and pretty concerning. And we've also gotten some good reaction right out of the gate. Right out of the gate after our first story, the governor, Henry McMaster, and lawmakers called for closing some ethics loopholes that were allowing these gas authorities to avoid declaring gifts and things of that nature. And they want to subject these gas authorities now to further regulation and scrutiny from state regulators. Another story we did on this trash utility that was planning on taking a nice weekend up at the Grove Resort outside of Asheville. And we calculated that they basically get about 7 hours of work for this 3-day retreat at a cost of $14,000 to taxpayers. And after we ran the story, they shut that down and they decided to have their little retreat closer to home. And they said, in the future, I think we'll stay home and do these things, because they didn't like the scrutiny there. Group of Lawmakers in the upstate also have formed a task force to look into special purpose districts. We've done a story up there about a fire department where a commissioner was serving while her husband was moving rapidly through the ranks, and they were spending thousands of dollars on parties, and there was all sorts of interesting things going on there. So now they want to form a task force to find out if this is the best use of taxpayer dollars, if these districts are in need of more scrutiny as well. One of the stories pointed out that the state law enforcement division, which has done like 1,400 misconduct cases in the last decade, lacked a white collar crime unit, and they lacked a forensic auditor, which costs, I guess, about $160,000 a year. So say if a small county called up SLED, said, hey, we think somebody is embezzling money from our general fund here. Very concerned about that. Oftentimes SLED would say, well, we have nobody to crunch those numbers, so we're going to need the county to go out and hire an auditor. And that delays the time it's going to take for agents to come in and start really investigating. We ran into that recently in the town of Wagner, where there's some real concerns. That's in Aiken County. Real concerns about money transfers going in and out of the fire department budget. And one of our partner reporters in Aiken found that some of the money had gone to, there were checks being written to members of the former fire chief's family for like tuition and books and things like that, and a number of purchases made with fire department funds at firearm stores and for a NRA membership. So 7 months after the mayor sounded the alarm on this, the county is still trying to hire an auditor to look at the books. And they sort of blame that on, oh, people get busy during tax season, so we couldn't find an auditor to crunch the numbers for us. Meanwhile, SLED, I believe, is in sort of a holding pattern, waiting to find out what the forensic audit shows. So after we pointed some of these things out, the state Senate has included $160,000 in the state budget this year to hire a forensic auditor. Is it going to solve everything? No, but it could really make a difference in at least jumpstarting some of these investigations. Lawmakers are also looking into some questionable contracts at the John De La Howe Governor's School. It's kind of a little known governor's school up in McCormick County. And we exposed some things up there where the former head of school had gone to work for the consultant she hired, making about $1,500 a day. And one of the board members or one of the staff members there, some contracts had gone to someone who he had a business relationship with. So lawmakers are looking into that and asking some hard questions. I mentioned the Greenwood paper earlier. They've been, another great thing. We did this big deep dive into the De La Howe School with their assistants and partnership. And then they sort of took the ball and ran with it and have been digging in hard, and they've uncovered a whole bunch of other stuff. They found out that all these contracts that were going out that probably would have drawn some scrutiny because they were tied to this one official's, one of his business partners. They were submitting contracts that were just under the threshold for having to be scrutinized by the state Department of Administration, I believe. And no, anyway, the procurement office, they were right under the threshold, so nobody was looking at these things. And there was enough of them, and the paper just a litany of these things that it happened. So it wasn't like a fluke. It was a regular practice that apparently was being done to skirt state purchasing laws. So again, we're getting some real results here, I think, right out of the box, and excited to see where we're going to go from there. And feel pretty thankful to work for a place like the Post and Courier. If you look around the country with some of these news deserts, I mean, a lot of it's being driven by economics within the industry. I mean, we've had declining ad revenue for many, many years as things like Craigslist ate into classified ads. And, people are advertising on different platforms these days or going to Facebook for things. So there's that. Then there's consolidation within the industry where these sort of greedy corporate chains have gobbled up newspapers and cut to the bone to make profit. And hedge funds, this Alden hedge fund is gobbled up the Denver Post and now the Baltimore Sun and bunch of other papers. So you're seeing jobs lost in troves and real cuts into the watchdog function that really is what newspapers are all about. I feel pretty fortunate here. We're owned by a family-owned group, and they've just been tremendous in terms of supporting our work with resources. They want to tell stories that are compelling, stories that matter, stories that make a difference. And they've given us great support throughout the years doing that and continue to do so. So we're in kind of in my mind, sort of a luxury point. We're at a great place and in a thriving paper that's growing and continuing to do good work. And so we're just trying to share that, I guess, with some of our partners. That I believe sort of what I had prepared. I'm happy to take questions or discussion, anything you all want.
Great. Thank you so much, Glenn. Yeah, you talked about the sort of response of authorities and things. What's been the response of readers to these things? Because a couple of times I've read things that you guys have published. I'm thinking particularly about the Quins. You were talking about cronyism and the revelations that were coming out there about the political cronyism at the very top of the state. And there never seemed to be terribly much response from the public to that sort of thing. So, can you comment a little bit on what the public's reaction, the reader's reaction is to your uncovering these things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The Quins, for those unfamiliar, Richard Quinn was this political kingmaker up in Columbia, just also high clients, really pulled the levers on all sorts of different issues. Very powerful guy, and his son was a former House Majority Leader, and they got caught up in this whole state house corruption scandal, which was really eye-opening for a lot of us, because I know after Operation Lost Trust decades ago, they cleaned up the state legislature. We were always being touted as one of the better run states where these things weren't happening. And back under Lost Trust, it was like lawmakers getting a meal or two, or getting treated to some things like that. Here, you had lawmakers making, $10,000s of dollars, or one guy almost $1 million working behind the scenes on these things. The amount of money was staggering. And we did all these stories that exposed us and the state and other papers that exposed real wrongdoing. And the reaction was pretty tepid, honestly. People seem to think, oh, well, of course that stuff happens. There's, cynicism about government. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, what did you expect? And, we always knew this stuff was going on. No, I was surprised that there wasn't more outrage. With this stuff, I've seen a mix. It's been really interesting. We've got, like I said, we've gotten a lot of tips, a lot of people calling us in saying, thank you for doing this. I've been suspicious of my town councilman, school board chairman, my leaders for years. You ought to look at this other thing too, which is equally concerning, or just thank you for finally telling the story and getting this out there. This is an important service. So we've gotten that. Also gotten calls. We did a story about a acting mayor up in Dillon who is a doctor, and he had made, I think, 80,000 or 85,000 off medical contracts with the town over the course of a decade that he'd failed to disclose. He had never put it on state ethics forms. It was all no bid work. They just sort of came to some arrangement, and it was never put out to other providers. And when they did this year, finally, a couple other firms were competing for the work, and he eventually was like, I want nothing to do. But some of the people in that area got some pushback on that, saying, oh, well, he doesn't need that money. He's a good guy, and what does it matter anyway? And he's a rich guy. That's pocket change to him. And I was like, it's not the amount that is important. It's the process and the controls or the lack thereof. And they said, well, you'd have a hard time finding, one reader said, you'd have a real hard time finding anyone that would care. I bet you couldn't even find someone to do that work. I said, well, that's funny, because at least 2 other firms bid for it and were interested in taking on that once they had an opportunity to do so after a decade. And even in town, this one councilman who had sort of broached some of these issues and called the guy out at a meeting, he was getting all sorts of blowback too for like taking on this, I guess, beloved figure in town. And again, maybe the doctor's a great guy, and he's, you know, by all accounts, he's done some great work. It's not really to pillory his reputation per se. It's to talk about the lack of controls and both the work and people are harmed as a result, I think. So yeah, it's been a mixed bag with the reaction.
Interesting. Sarah Redmond has a quick question for you, very direct, I think. So Sarah, if you want to unmute, and then Bill Epps after that.
Yes, I think what you're doing is incredibly important. I subscribe to the paper and I contributed to the fund. Would love to have you speak to our Dorchester County Democratic Party general meeting. If it was via Zoom, would you be able to do something like that?
Possibly, yeah. I gotta see. I'm not sure what the rules are, to be perfectly frank, in terms of talking to political groups or how we handle that. I haven't done that before. I wouldn't mind. I just don't know what the rules are. I can get back to you though.
Perfect. I will put my email address in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for reading, being a subscriber, and for donating. It's much appreciated.
You know, it's a fabulous paper, and I am from Michigan, and my heart breaks every time I read the Detroit Free Press now. All it is sports information. I think that's what they're surviving on.
Yeah, I come from around Hartford, Connecticut, and the Hartford Courant up there was just this fabulous paper when I was growing up. My dad got me into reading papers real young. I delivered the paper, and I would sit there at 6 a.m. reading the front page every day, and he and I would talk about it. And I was just so amazed by the work that they'd done that won a Pulitzer years ago about the problems with the Hubble telescope, and they just did some very good stuff. And they're now owned by the Alden hedge fund, so they are part of the Tribune Group, and they've just been gutted. All the people got laid off, and the coverage has gone down. It's really, really sad to see. So I share that concern with you.
Bill, go ahead.
Great. I just I went to school in Hartford, and know the Courant well, and sorry to hear this news about it. I was wondering, you were describing in response to Simon's question about the tepid response to the Quinn reporting. I'm wondering how much of the writing and the work, as you conceive it in your group, is basically tantamount to some civics and ethics education, and whether or not that has changed over time.
Yeah. I think it's important for the context and all that. And I think in all our reporting with Uncovered and with the Quinn stuff too, I think part of the Quinn stuff was, it was so complicated. There were we built this graphic that showed all these different people in the Quinn universe, and the cast of characters was really large, contracts and hard to follow. And it's as simple as you tried to make that. But yeah, and all the Uncovered stuff, I think we try to explain what the ethics laws are, why they're in place, why these things matter, and the consequences of not having them there, the loopholes in them. And as much as possible, we try to compare ourselves to other states and other places recently I did the story on this oyster farm over on James Island that won approval. The players was working for DNR on the application to begin with, and it was his brother's farm, and then he left DNR and went there. One of the things that was interesting though was looking at the state. There were some concerns expressed about the leases that the state was granting for these oyster farms. It was like $5 to $10 an acre for the leasing of public, marshlands and waterways, public lands. And I looked around, I was curious what other states were doing. And like Georgia, it starts at $50, and North Carolina was $120 an acre. And they said it was, this is a public resource. We should maximize the benefit from that. And also we want to be very transparent about who's getting these leases. And like North Carolina, you could look it up on a map, see who has the lease, how many acres it is, how long it runs for. In South Carolina, they have the law to say that you can't use any of that information. So you can't, they're leasing the lands at a bargain rate, and then they won't tell you who has them. So yeah, I think it's important to have that sort of context in there though.
John Preston has what looks like a fairly practical question for you, Glenn. John, if you want to unmute.
Oh.
Well, he seems not to be coming on. He says, live in Charleston during the winter and I subscribe electronically. Did a presentation to this group a few weeks ago that included mention of the SCE&G electric power outage of 2014. When I searched for articles on the outage, I found it difficult to find them using the search feature, even though I had the specific date, title, and reporter's name. Does the electronic version grant me full search access to the old PNC articles? I was particularly interested in the statements made by SCE&G claiming they had no way to know what to do in advance of a cold snap, in spite of a complete analysis of a similar outage in Texas in 2011.
Yeah, there's the answer to your question is yes, with a caveat. You're absolutely can search there, and it should capture all the old articles. There's also an archive search that's a little harder to find. If you wanted to contact me offline, I could probably point you in the right direction. The one caveat is that a few years back, we searched, changed from one, what's called a content management system. Basically, it's a platform we produce the newspaper on. It's where we keep our editorial files and stuff. And we switched from one provider to another that we thought was better. In the process, some of the articles from a certain period of time did not make the transition. So we're trying, in cases where you find stuff like that, let us know and we'll try to restore some of those. I think we've gotten a lot of those over time, but in some cases there are gaps. You can also try just the search function. It's okay. I oftentimes will just Google, Post and Courier and what I'm looking for, and can find it faster that way. That's another option.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to help you find what you're looking for.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
If I could follow up.
Okay.
I was specifically interested in 2014 when we had the cold snap and lost power. An SCE&G spokesman was quoted in the Courier as saying, well, these plants are too complicated. We couldn't have known in advance, how to prevent it. But there was a cold snap in Texas in 2011, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did a complete analysis and published it. And exactly the same thing happened to South Carolina then 3 years later. And I don't know that, I think I heard after the recent Texas outage that the local utilities said, well, we've done this stuff. I don't know that anybody's followed up and asked them, did you really? And are we vulnerable to a similar outage should South Carolina get a cold snap again?
Yeah, it's a good question. Something we should ask about. I know we did a little asking around the time of the Texas thing because it obviously brought up some questions. But yeah, I mean, if the feds can come up with a big report giving you all the roadmap of how to correct things, I guess if nobody reads it or applies those lessons, then you're sort of left vulnerable and you don't learn from the past. So that's a good question. I'll put that down as something we should look into. Because yeah, I mean, we've had a few incidents. Obviously doesn't get super cold here or snow very often, but I mean, we've had certainly, God, with the bridge there with the stalactites coming down at us. It happens.
Yeah, and we've had some issues with the energy generating companies, right?
Yes.
With SCE&G and Scanner and all that sort of stuff. Glenn, I was going to ask you about the public support sort of nationally for newspapers, things like ProPublica, but also, is there any agency that is supporting the teaching of journalism and journalistic ethics? I'm conscious, for instance, that the College of Charleston, for instance, has a communication department, but we've actually scrapped the journalist side of things. So in communication, we now do things like organizational communication and interpersonal communication and PR and all that sort of stuff. But actual journalism has kind of dropped off the map. And you could say, well, that's responsible because there are fewer jobs perhaps available to graduates. But it seems to me a terrible loss. And I wonder whether any national agencies are funding that sort of thing, or indeed the kind of thing that you're doing or that ProPublica is doing.
Yeah, well, as far as I could tell, it's mostly private nonprofits and foundations and things like that. I know there's a push at the federal level in some sector to come up with perhaps government funding for journalism. And I was talking to somebody recently from a rural news outlet organization that covers rural news, and they were asking me what I thought of that. And I mean, I guess it would be great to have a consistent stream of funding to depend on, but then I'd also, on another level, be worried about what sort of conditions that comes with, right? I mean, you're getting money from the very people that you're keeping an eye on and being the watch. Does it diminish the watchdog function, or does it hamper your ability to do that? I guess I'd have to know how that plays out. There are a number of organizations, though, as we found, that do support the work, ProPublica being one of them. Was it 2 years ago, they funded our year-long project into judges, some of the problems with South Carolina judges and magistrates. And they worked, they paid for a reporter for a year, and they worked with us closely on the edits and really got the word out on that. That was a good relationship. We've partnered with a few. The Center for Public Integrity was another one that helped us on a project we called Capital Gains several years ago, about how lawmakers were using their campaign funds like personal ATMs. And so there's some of those, and there's also some organizations that the Pulitzer Center, for one, has been great. You basically pitch them with ideas that fit into some of their subject areas, and if they like it, they will provide funding. They paid for us to go to Africa for this story that we ran last weekend, I Am Omar. That's an interesting story. It was initially supposed to be tied in with the Spoleto opera that was going to debut in the spring of 2020, and the reporters were actually getting on the plane to fly to Senegal when they started. President Trump announced that there was going to be all these restrictions and they're closing travel down and stuff. So we pulled them basically off the gangway before they got on the airplane to go. And then Spoleto canceled the opera, and then we decided to go again this year, and then Spoleto postponed it again, but we went ahead with the trip. But yeah, the Pulitzer Center paid for all the travel and driver and translator, and it's fantastic. And they also provided us some funding for our Rising Waters series on Charleston's flooding issues and climate-driven flooding issues, and allowed us to do some things that we otherwise might not have been able to do. And they're underwriting another project for us this year that I'm not sure I'm at liberty to talk about, but it'll be cool.
Okay, great. I mean, those are all great things. The Omar piece was fabulous. I hope anybody hasn't seen that already, check it out. It's got a terrific web presence as well, so should be easy to find. And I remember the judge and magistrate thing. I've been reading that and going, what? I was quite staggered at the kinds of people that we were putting in these positions with absolutely zero experience or training. And they're the folks who are actually sitting in judgment on our fellow citizens. I mean, quite bizarre.
Yeah, political qualifications over any other qualifications in most cases. Yeah.
Crazy. So, any other questions from folks? This has been a very quiet audience today. I'm surprised. I thought we'd get lots more hot topics popping up. I'm not seeing anything. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much indeed, Glenn. This has been terrific. And, this was a smallish group here, but I think you can recognize that you've got a bunch of fans here, and we're rooting for another Pulitzer for you guys.
Oh, well, thank you. That's,
Simon,
yes.
I'm slow at this,
Okay.
but I just want to say this has been fantastic. It's really good to hear some feedback from this because Ron and I have been very interested in it and contribute to the whole thing and read in the paper what's going on. But thank you for coming. It's wonderful. Even if this event is not well attended, and I'm really sorry, a bunch of Unitarians, there are only 16 people here.
That's
Anyway,
okay. That's fine. Thank you. And again, thank you for supporting our work. As Simon said at the very beginning, it's I don't know, I feel passionately about newspapers. Like I've made it really my adult life's calling to do this work, and it's been immensely satisfying. We've brought about a lot of change, and I guess getting into it, I'll share one story. When I was just getting into the field, I didn't really know what I was doing. They sent me out to cover, I was covering my hometown, and I got a call from some residents, and they were concerned about people speeding on the street. It was a long stretch in this sort of rural area, and they were afraid to have their kids out, and they wanted to put a stop sign in the middle of it to slow people down. And they talked town for like 5 years, and town kept saying, oh, you don't put stop signs out to slow people down, and that's not what traffic engineering does, and we've looked at this before, and people get off our backs. So, but I felt they needed to be heard, so I wrote a story about it, and they got their stop sign, and I cursed the stop sign every time I had to stop for it, but it made a huge difference in that neighborhood because it did slow people down, and they weren't afraid to put their kids out playing in the yards. And it made, for a small number of people, it wasn't the biggest story ever. It ran deep inside the paper. Probably nobody but me remembers it at this point, and the people that live in that neighborhood, but it made a huge difference for the people in that neighborhood. And I realized right then that was sort of the power of journalism to, hold officials accountable and to speak up for the common people who are just trying to get on with their lives in the best way possible. So any way to help. And obviously we're doing things of a much larger scale these days, but it remains immensely satisfying and important work. And I thank you all for listening to me, taking an interest in this, supporting our work, and please stay tuned. We have so much more to come, and reach out to me anytime. Personally, if you want, you have any other questions, or you need some help, or if John needs some help finding that SC&G article, let me know, and I can be of assistance. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you again so much. This is terrific. I mean, what you're describing there, the kind of zeroing in on particular local issues, that's exactly what this church does through the CAJM activity, the Charleston Area Justice Ministry, and your process as a newspaper of figuring out one particular thing to focus on, whether it's domestic violence or it's flooding or whatever. That's exactly the same process that we've been going through with CAJM, trying to figure out all these problems that we're facing here, because we're too high up the rankings of things you don't want to be high up the rankings in. We're way down the rankings on things you want to be high up on. And so we have to try and figure out every year one thing to look at, whether it's education or transport or healthcare or whatever. So it's exactly the same kind of process. So I think everybody at this church, everybody in this congregation who's invested in CAJM ought also to be absolutely invested in local journalism, Post and Courier in particular, obviously, but also the City Paper and the Chronicle, and anything anybody can do to keep supporting these things and reading and writing letters to the editor and stuff, that would be absolutely fantastic. So anyway, thanks, Glenn, and we will start up again in late September on these things, but this has been a terrific finale to a really good series. So thank you again, Glenn, and thanks to all the faithful attendees, the audience folks.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye.